G'day, mate. And how the bloody hell are ya? Welcome to In the Back of My Head podcast, episode 68. This one is a departure. This one is different. This one is not the usual just rambles about creativity. This one is thoughts, but also a lot of research, a bit of a story, a bit of a tale, a bit of a rabbit hole. If you enjoy a rabbit hole, I hope you stick through it. We're going to talk about propaganda, art and war and art. We're going to talk about NATO-arts. I've spoken plenty about putting politics into your art, wearing your politics on your sleeve, wearing your beliefs on your sleeve. As an artist, you develop a strong point of view. Or rather, I believe that you need a strong point of view. Be it a worldview, be it a social view, be it simply a view of how your life has played out, how you view the world, I think should be developed and expressed. It's what gives your art purpose, meaning, beyond just another part of the art landscape. It's the one thing that can't possibly be replicated is your exact worldview. And I've been thinking about and fascinated by art's role in politics, not only as a reflection, but a role it actually plays in the shaping of politics, shaping of war, shaping of economics. As I feel, when we think of art in politics, I think we usually go one way. We usually think to the reaction. We think of the Banksies. We think of the Ai Weiweis. We think about like Kendrick Lamar or Rage Against the Machine or the Sex Pistols. We think about punk music. We think about hip hop. We think about art as a reflection. Art as a reflection of the world around us, and that especially means politics. But I'd say at various points in human history, depending on the situation, then it would be a privilege to be making art that could be at all deemed successful, that is reactionary to politics. I'm sure at any given moment in time where there has been a large change, large discourse, then there has been reactionary art at every turn. Perhaps more underground than propped up into the masses. We live at a curious time now, I think, where political art, be it music, be it physical art, be it movies. Anti-capitalist is a good example. Anti-capitalist material can fit very nicely into capitalism. For purchasing it, kind of gets you out of that little slump. You get to be a anti-capitalist tourist, much like I'm sure myself. And you still bought something, so it all works out. Continues on. Art has been an important part of political movements through the use of commissioned art. There's a lot of amazing art that has been created with a very particular worldview trying to be communicated, that has been commissioned by the powers that be. However, it's still incredible work, still beautiful pieces. An interesting and obvious example I thought of was the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. Now at the time, maybe you wouldn't think of the Catholic Church as a large political body. I don't see how that could possibly be true though. It dictates the world around it, it imposes laws, maybe not in the same way as we are now, but nonetheless, they are imposing laws, they are deciding the way that the world works. And the Sistine Chapel, the paintings by Michelangelo, are a wonder of the world, considered one of the greatest artistic pieces of all time. A more recent example could be the Obama Hope posters from 2008. Became almost sort of a meme at that point, you know? And especially looking back. It's a format, it's an image that is easy to replicate. But that was created by an artist. It was created by an artist. In fact, it was created by an artist outside of the campaign. It was created it was never actually an official poster. I thought it was. I thought the Hope posters for Obama's campaign was an official poster. But no. It was created by Shepard Fairey, famous for the Obey fashion line, which I'm sure you've seen. This feels like a piece that harkens back to propaganda of the Cold War, or even World War II, but I think more striking of that of the Soviet Union. The art critic Peter Schaldau called the poster the most efficacious American political illustration since Uncle Sam Wants You. An absolute classic. A brilliant poster, the Uncle Sam Wants You. It represents sending a lot of young American boys to their deaths in war, much as many propaganda posters do. But as a simple piece, looking at it, you go, well, it's a pretty nice piece though, isn't it? And I think the simplest example, the best example, love 'em or hate 'em, is that of the Soviet Union's propaganda. Some of the most striking design, I would say still to this day, is still referenced so often, is still so powerful. And if you want to go for a little less problematic of the propaganda, the things like their work for the space race. Absolutely incredible images. And I wanted to bring up this piece, and if you're listening, there's a lot of visual elements to this episode, but I'll try and explain them regardless through words. A striking, incredible, otherworldly, certainly scenes of another time. Even in the modern hubris of humanity, this still seems like of almost an entirely different generation as it is, but an entirely different way of approaching the grandeur of art, especially approaching the grandeur of propaganda. There is a statue called the Motherland Coals, built in 1967. It's in Volgograd, it's in Russia. It was built to honor the Soviet soldiers who fought in the Battle of Stalingrad, and it is 85 meters tall. It is a statue of Mother Russia pointing a sword forward, calling the people of Russia forward to the front lines. I suppose to die for their honor, to defend the country. I'm not here to make any statements or offer any opinions because I don't really have any on any of this in terms of the meaning behind it to the lives that it affected. Simply looking at it as a piece of incredible craftsmanship and art. Now, propaganda is perhaps appropriately, but maybe not always, a dirty word. I mean, it's often based on lies, or at least lies of admission. You have to simplify everything. I spoke at the start of having your worldview, a clean, crisp worldview, and imposing that upon your art, communicating extremely clearly and simply to those you need to communicate to. And that's what propaganda is there for. Good propaganda does that beautifully. It's a simplification of information. It is there to convey what you want as simply and as effectively as possible. There's a few tools it can use. I think our go-tos, especially in like the worlds of more fictional propaganda, thinking like 1984, though I've not read it, speak more to fear. Speak more to fear. I see that's what we experience most at the moment, is look at American propaganda. All the people coming across the border, they are your real enemy. They are just using fear against you. But you can also use hope. You can also use a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. These often go hand in hand with fear, especially when defending a territory. I think that's really something that I think sticks out about the Russian propaganda is the Soviet propaganda. It was very hopeful. It was very looking forward to a bright future. Whereas America's propaganda at the time looked much more like, let's roll up our sleeves and go beat the shit out of some people. Just as I am talking about massive simplifications, you're going to get some massive simplifications. This is all an intro, don't you worry. This is not this is not as important as it sounds. It's fascinating though to look at these things that have wide-reaching effects on people's lives and are deemed as terrible things. And again, I'm not saying that they're not. Propaganda shapes the world around it. It can be completely false or lies of admission. But the people behind it, not all propaganda. Propaganda can take many forms. In terms of this kind of propaganda that I'm talking about, it is artists though. People made this stuff. Artists, content creators, writers, screenwriters, actors. They are artistic expressions regardless of the purpose. There is still a kernel of creativity there at the heart. Could be as simple as, commissions, artists trying to make a living. But what about artists who believe in the cause? This was my jumping off point. This is the catalyst for this little thought experiment at the moment. This is the catalyst for this little thought journey. What about when you actually believe it? What about when you actually buy it? What about when you actually believe in this worldview, that you share the view of what you think is the state? There are many content creators right now, I think especially in America, who buy the American dream concept and make propaganda for it. Not because it's commissioned, but because they actually believe in it. It's a little bit different to making a giant 85-meter statue. But what happens if you actually believe in the cause? So when you think of propaganda, what do you think of? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Is it what we've been speaking about? Is it World War II posters? Posters of the Soviet Union? Is it Fox News? Is it ambient electronic albums? Yeah, probably not that last one. But funnily enough, that's actually my jumping off point. That's where this all started. Because I want to tell you about an album that I found that was released in 1999. Because I find a lot of my music these days through YouTube. I've spoken a bit about this, about the algorithm is actually doing a damn fine job. As much as algorithms controlling our lives, and especially controlling our taste in content and art, can be in many ways problematic, it's also led me to discover lots of weird hidden gems. I've really gone down the ambient, electronic and experimental album rabbit hole. Mostly 70s stuff, some 80s, this one's from the 90s. I got recommended an album that piqued my interest. The cover, which will be on screen now, fit my vibe exactly what I was looking for. It's called Distant Early Warning by Icebreaker International. And in the description of the video, the uploader mentioned that he had found this record randomly and has said that on the cover it was commissioned by Nato-arts. And in the comments section I went and people were confused and perplexed. The fuck is Nato-arts? And I repeated that, what the fuck is Nato-arts? And so I went digging into it. And lo and behold, there existed an arts collective that you probably have never heard of. I certainly never heard of it. But you've certainly heard of its parent organization, NATO. And I'll just read you the quote from the Nato-arts website, which is where I found myself. Nato-arts is an international arts organization which seeks to promote global security and stability through the exhibition of works of conceptual art. It is governed by a 19-member board of directors with a representation from each of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization member states. Nato-arts was founded on April 4th, 1999 by unanimous motion of the North Atlantic Committee. As an organization operating under Article 23 of the United Nations 1971 Oslo Accord, Nato-arts is not affiliated with any sovereign state, but is instead governed by a board of directors subject to international law. As of 2004, Nato-arts activities have been suspended until further notice, and its founding members are currently pursuing other projects. I don't pretend to know nearly enough to discuss NATO as an organization. But the idea that it is completely impartial and not really affiliated with any sovereign state seems a little bit far-fetched. There are certain nations that have a lot more pull in such organizations, to the point of, you could argue, having quite a bit of control over such an organization. And certain nations certainly subscribe to, are run by, and promote the idea of a particular political system known as capitalism. And so what better way to promote global trade and the free market than with ambient and alternative electronic music? I can think of no other way, mate. I can think of no other way. And so the first project for NATOarts was Icebreaker International, Train Mask, a report to the NATOarts Board of Directors. I do apologize now, because there is going to be a lot of names and words that I may butcher. I'll try my goddamn darndest, baby. Two musicians, Alexander Pearls and Simon Brake, gathered a handful of synthesizers and recording equipment, and they boarded the container ship Train Mask at the port of Yokohama in Japan. They were to produce an audio report. A 7-week journey visiting ports around the globe, making ambient electronic music to report back to the NATOarts Board of Directors. Hence the title of the record. Another quote, this time from them. This report is intended not only for use by academics and policymakers, but also as a guide for artists, merchants, and members of the public who wish to make connections between contemporary developments in conceptual art and international trade. Mr. Brake and Mr. Pearls hope that this document will be a tool to open national markets to free and unfettered global exchange. A beautiful, noble cause for a couple of boys with some synthesizers. And so, I was perplexed, I was befuddled, I was confused, and so I bought a copy of this CD from Discogs for way too much money. For way too much bloody money. And inside, this is the reason I bought it, because inside is a booklet that acts as a report for each port that they visited to accompany each song. And so we're going to go through. We're going to read some of these reports, we're going to hear some snippets of the music, and we will discuss at the end. Here's a little taste, a little abridged version. Icebreaker International, Train Mask, a report to the NATOarts Board of Directors. The port of Yokohama. Yokohama is Japan's second largest port and the world's 10th largest container facility. Yearly an average of 125 million tons of cargo and 2.1 million container TEUs, that's 20-foot equivalent units, pass through its breakwaters, surrounded on the north, east, and west sides by gently rolling hills. Although the port of Yokohama continues to grow, it faces serious challenges in the long run. Hamstrung by restrictive Japanese labor laws, complex environmental regulations, and a high federal tax burden, Yokohama finds it often cannot compete with ports such as Manila and Taipei, which enjoy large pools of inexpensive labor and lower taxes. And then we're off to the port of Singapore. Singapore has also won the favour of international business community through ambitious social engineering projects, such as the Speak Mandarin campaign, which began in 1979. Ethnic Chinese residents make up 76% of Singapore's population but speak a multitude of Chinese languages, such as Mandarin, Hokkien, Teochew, and Cantonese. With the Speak Mandarin campaign, the People's Action Party attempted to encourage Singapore's Chinese population to rationalise this confusing array of languages. Learning Mandarin, it was argued, would help Singapore's Chinese residents do business with mainland China and promote traditional Chinese values among them. Then to the port of Dubai. Dubai's best known attraction is the Jebel Ali Free Zone, or JAFZ. Established in 1985, the 100 square kilometre zone allows foreign corporations remarkable freedom for regulation and taxation. Brilliant. Dubai collects no taxes of any kind within the zone, and the zone is all but free of the restrictive labour and environmental standards associated with most Gulf economies. In order to continue to grow its economy, Dubai must diversify its industrial base while keeping costs low for foreign corporations. It must also resist pressures to impose unnecessary regulatory burdens on corporations. Oh, God forbid. Don't regulate the corporations. The Port of Rotterdam. Faced with an extreme shortage of land, Rotterdam has often reinvented itself. In the 1950s and 1960s, as Europe's demand for oil skyrocketed, Rotterdam became the continent's leading refinery centre. And since World War II, oil has come to constitute 60% of Rotterdam's imports. In order to accommodate larger and more modern refineries, the port undertook a huge and unprecedented project, the construction of Maasvlakte, a 1,300-hectare landfill at the terminus of the Rhine Delta. Refineries now located on the Maasvlakte have unimpeded access to the sea and spare the population of Rotterdam the sometimes undesirable byproducts of refinery operations. Oh, that's good. Glad they sorted that out. Port of Halifax. Recent undertakings by United Prefab, a corporation based in Houston, Texas, serve to illustrate the efficiencies possible at Halifax. In 1997, Life of Jesus Ministries, an Ohio corporation which finances and operates churches and chapels throughout the American Midwest, contracted United Prefab. At its state-of-the-art factory in Busan, now Busan, South Korea, United Prefab builds complete prefabricated houses of worship, which are flat-packed and sent by ship to Halifax. In 1997, a religious organization, a religious corporation in the United States, was ordering flat-packed churches from South Korea to be sent over to the States. That's just delicious. That's just fantastic. One thing you might immediately notice about this is that none of the music that I just played you, none of the snippets, seem to have anything to do with the ports that they were written about. They seem totally disconnected from the themes. And apparently that was the plan. Apparently that was the plan. A lot of my further reading into this album came from a 2015 article in Strauss Media. And I quote from it: "There was a feeling in the international security community and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the mid-1980s that the threats facing the Euro-Atlantic region had become not only a military threat, like we saw in Kosovo, but cultural threats. The aim of NATOarts is to advance the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's goal in the cultural realm. There was also a feeling that an organization such as NATO should take a more proactive role in the formation of international culture." This report wasn't just there to fill in the NATO board of directors about what's going on in international trade, but also to go out there and influence international culture. To be waving the flag, to be the first beacon of free trade and capitalism. Now, don't these songs make you feel inspired by the possible technological breakthroughs and the cultural, societal breakthroughs that are possible through free trade and capitalism? Through open international corridors? Now, the album that I actually found first, as I mentioned, was Distant Early Warnings, and was inspired by NATO's nuclear strike warning system in the Arctic. This was a strange time. I was digging through old articles, digging through their website, finding any little tidbit I could find. But this article by Strauss Media, they went digging a little further and they found some concerning signs about NATOarts. NATOarts was based in Soho, instead of at the NATOarts headquarters in Brussels. They mentioned that they have 19 members, one for each state, one for each member state of NATO. However, NATO only had 16 states at the time. And curiously, in the calendar of all NATO events featured in their 50th anniversary, NATOarts was never once mentioned. And perhaps most damning, when contacted, NATO representatives had never heard of NATOarts. When these facts were brought to the NATOarts team, they just said, that's sort of an internal matter, and we don't really comment on our relationship with our parent organization for various reasons. It could jeopardize our funding, and so on. We really like to keep things focused on the works of art. We don't talk about our budget. In the age of YouTube video essays, to actually stumble upon a thing that I went digging through and not having any clear idea of what is real and what is not was very exciting. Everything's being uncovered, and this was truly, for me at the moment, an incredible mystery that I felt like I was uncovering. And I felt a deep, intense frustration. And then finally excitement to realize that this is all bullshit. NATOarts doesn't exist. Which, in retrospect, seems so obvious, but at the time I was like, this can't be real, but I want it to be so badly. What it was music promotional law at its goddamn finest. Music promotional law building and theatre. The website, the exhibition that they put on an exhibition, the articles, the interviews, the costumes. They never broke character. They never once broke character. And so first and foremost, hats off to these guys. This is some of the finest world building and lore building for musical promotional purposes that I've ever seen. It gives the albums so much more depth. I love music that exists in a world of its own creation. I'm a huge Gorillaz fan, for example. But this got me thinking, as I believe was intended, about art and politics and art. Not art, again, as a reactionary force, but as a functional arm of politics. Art that is there to promote an ideology, art that is there to promote a political system, or a particular nation, a particular organization, what have you. A particular worldview. So what happens when you actually believe in the cause and you want to make art about that thing? Different, I think, to purely state-sanctioned art, though there is a blurry line there. But the artist's role in propaganda. There was another project that caught my eye on the NATO website. There wasn't a lot of information on it. It was only a small piece of the exhibition that they put on. I'm not even sure if it was a real exhibition, but there was photos of the exhibition. There was just one paragraph about this piece. I think it's just world building. I think it's just lore. But it was the Sakhalin 5. And again, I quote, this is the only bit of lore about this piece that was supposedly in the lore commissioned by NATOarts. In mid-1999, the World Trade Organization asked NATOarts to investigate reports of an arts organization forming in the Japanese underground that was seeking to disrupt economic expansion on the Pacific Rim. The board of directors dispatched several NATOarts artists to the Japanese archipelago in an attempt to identify the leader of this group. This was deeply fascinating. This was amazing. This I wanted to know more about. This I was wondering, okay, did they just take something from reality and just stick it in there to kind of give it more credibility? Because that's how this was all working. Connecting it to lots of little real world things to give it credibility. A simple world building trick. A collective of artists working not only to express opposition to a political movement, but to directly challenge it and try and halt it. This seemed like a beautiful distillation of what I'm talking about, art and politics. But that was before I realized it was all fake. I couldn't find anything more about the Sakhalin 5. However, connecting the law to the real world is a surefire way to give it credibility. And so perhaps this was based on something. And this led me to the Shikotan Group. I believe the inspiration for this tiny piece of law. See, the Sakhalin V is a reference to an island in northern Japan, Sakhalin Island. An island that is in a region that has seen a lot of conflict, a lot of disputes between Japan and Russia. The Kuril Islands. So, if you'll bear with me, let's have a little bit of a brief history lesson on the Kuril Islands dispute. An oblast is an administrative division in Bulgaria and several post-Soviet states, including Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And just north of Japan's most northern island, Hokkaido, is the Sakhalin Oblast, containing the Sakhalin Islands and the Kuril Islands. The Kuril Islands, to this day, are a group of islands consumed by land disputes between Russia and Japan. This has been going on for ages. This is called the Kuril Islands dispute. The first treaty between Russia and Japanese Empire was signed in 1855, the Treaty of Shimoda. This is essentially the end of Sakoku, the isolationist foreign policy of Japan that had lasted for the previous 220 years. It also defined the border between Japan and Russia for the time. The whole island of Iturup belongs to Japan, and the whole island of Urup belongs to Russia, with the border between the two nations passing between these islands. In 1875, Japan ceded its half of Sakhalin Island in exchange for ownership of the Kuril Islands. However, for some reason, which I can't work this out, I'm only reading through Wikipedia articles mostly for this, but I can't work out why this treaty was written in French. And due to poor translation from French to Japanese, there was controversy in the constitution of the Kuril Islands. Which islands are part of the Kuril Islands? This lack of clear agreement and then outright hostility continued through the late 1800s to the early 1900s with the Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan took southern Sakhalin Island. And then, big news, the fall of Germany in World War II. The Soviet-Japanese War kicked off with the infamous Yalta Conference. And to summarize briefly, this was a conference between the Big Three, the United States, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union to decide the fate of the post-war Europe. Part of this agreement was that the Soviets desired the return of southern Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands. And in 1945, as part of the Yalta Conference, Yalta Agreements, the Soviets declared war on Japan and invaded South Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands. With unfinished or unsigned peace treaties, poor translations, and disagreements over which islands are part of the Kuril Islands, these disputes continue to this day. There have been conflicts, though minor in comparison to what we've talked about so far. But the main thing I've found through reading this, and yes, I'm talking again mostly about Wikipedia, is the common point of contention in any border conflict like this. And that is what territories are historically part of each country. We've gone through various governments, empires. Information gets lost, people have different ideas of what territory is whose, both historically and current, who has ownership, who has rights to it. Depends on who you ask, when you ask, and which parts of history you take seriously compared to which you disregard. Again, I'm not here to give any viewpoints or ideas or thoughts or anything like that on this, because I don't know anything about this. Very brief reading about it. But it brings me to the Shikotan Group and the tactics used to give legitimacy to one's claim over a certain part of land. We've talked about art as a means of a political agenda, propaganda. But what about art to legitimize your claims over territory? So in the 1960s through to the 1990s, artists from Moscow were led by Oleg Loshikov to the Kuril Islands with brushes and canvases in hand. They were making their way on their own dime. They weren't paid by Moscow, but they were given promise that they could show their works in Moscow, I suppose in hopes of fame and recognition for their work. And they produced paintings containing motifs typical of Soviet Russian style at the time. Industry and progress were often depicted, and the landscapes themselves were painted in a way that was reminiscent of other parts of the country, of Russia. However, they would show the double-peaked volcano Mount Taicha and the wide curved bay of, I'm sorry about this one, Malakaliskia, the Bay of Malakaliskia in Shikotan. Some of these are real rough for an absolute novice to try and pronounce any of this shit. So these became signifying motifs of the paintings. But they were depicting somewhat exotic landscapes, while also alongside typical Russian industry, such as Soviet fishing factories, creating a sense of belonging to the Russian people in these lands. A way of, through art, legitimizing presence in the region. There are elements, however, of traditional Japanese imagery as well, such as shrines and arches, giving kind of a representation of coexistence. So it turns out, yeah, it's not uncommon for artists to travel to other lands and paint what they see, but in the style of their homeland. I'm sure to a degree it's probably not always political. Like, artists are human. Just like all humans, they occupy a grey area of morality and exist only in a moment, a blip of endless history. Landscape painting is not where I would expect politics to arise and to be used as a tool to legitimize ownership of territory, to legitimize control or particular ideology, but there it is. And were these artists doing it intentionally? Were they just painting how they know? Certainly some credence to the idea that this was very much a calculated move. A fascinating tactic, especially of a region that had seen so much conflict, so much debate over so many years. And then for a new tactic, let's try just painting the area with some traditional motifs of our people in the area to give legitimacy. A fascinating tactic, a deeply sinister tactic, a deeply sinister use of art. I certainly have no deep understanding of the dispute of the Kuril Islands, and I have no opinions on the Russian-Japanese relationships and conflicts. But I was fascinated by this tale, fascinated by this story. Seeing a team of painters out as a political tool, paintbrushes and canvases, painting landscapes. I will say, NATOarts is some of the best bloody world building that I have ever found surrounding music or art in general. It was a lot of fun to dig through, and I really felt like I was uncovering something lost or forgotten. What it did for me was, just show again how fascinated I am by geopolitics and art. Its role in it. The worldview that you have to develop to give your art meaning. You could use it in a noble way, or you can use it in a very sinister way. Much as how we've discussed it here. It's got to shine through. It's got to come through. Life and opinions and history, it's all just grey areas. Keep politics out of art is, of course, one of the dumbest phrases you can say in regards to art. Humanity observes the natural world around it and it shapes it through its organization, states, ideals, and art. Our world is comprised of impossibly complex relationships. We aren't individuals, we are part of the earth. We live in states or other organizations of humans. We have different groups, we have different views, we have different beliefs. There's chaos. There's grey areas. It is a collective, regardless of how messy. I believe art is how we represent the world that we want to see and reflect the world that is before us now. but it also changes how others see the world. Everything is viewed through our personal lens, our personal view, and when that lens changes, when that view changes, the very world changes before you. Well, that episode was quite a departure from my normal rambles. A lot more work went into it. It's also, though, a format that I'm not really used to developing a full piece like that. So, if it wasn't quite there, I'll get you next time. But I hope you enjoyed the weird rabbit hole, the weird story of Nato-arts, the Kuril Islands, the Suckling Five. If you enjoy what I'm doing, if you enjoy this podcast, hit me up on Patreon, throw me a couple of bucks. But otherwise, like and comment, rate me on whatever podcast platform you're listening to, and be well, mate. I'll be back with more episodes that are far less effort, more rambles about art, creativity. Be well, mate. See you next time.